And we want to continue to dive into this because this is the eve of this deadline involving the former president, some $454 million in this fraud lawsuit put forth by New York Attorney General Letitia James. We're going to be joined right now by attorney Jeremy Rosenthal. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And of course, tomorrow is the day that potentially New York could seize some of these properties if he doesn't pay this $454 million sum. Will that happen tomorrow, or what's next in terms of what goes on here?
It's anybody's guess. I mean, maybe somebody comes to his rescue. He's currently trying to get sureties, trying to get banks, trying to get creative with meeting this bond amount. That may or may not happen tomorrow. The appellate court probably isn't going to step in. Most of their rulings, I'm told, are on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So we might not get help there. So tomorrow could be kind of a D-Day for him, a day that's, I mean, it's like predicting the weather. I think we're all on this roller coaster, yeah?
Yeah, I think we all are. And of course, this is just one amongst many cases we've been following. And of course, they talk about seizing properties. What would that look like? How would a state seize a property? How would that go down?
Collections is its own industry, right? And this is New York State. Even that being the case, I don't think it's mob run, which is the good news. But collections are their own industry. The state knows where all these assets are because these assets were the subject of this entire case. You could see liens getting filed, which is probably the most cost-effective way for them to enforce it, meaning that before Mr. Trump or somebody tries to sell the property, that the state of New York gets paid off. Obviously, that's going to hurt the value, you would think, of some of those properties. Seizing the properties, foreclosing on properties, that's where things start to get expensive. Maybe you have a situation where they want to spike the football and have a big showing of something. There's a lot of tricky ways about this, but as far as collections go, I'll tell you this much: the lawyers that I know that are into hardcore bankruptcy and into collections and things like that, they say this is a bit of a cakewalk because the hardest single part about this is figuring out where all these assets are, and they know because you just read the 92-page judgment, and they know where the assets are.
That is a very good point because obviously this is kind of what the whole premise of this case was about. I do want to ask you, because Trump's lawyers have called it a practical impossibility to get that money this quickly as well. And we're not talking about 10 million, we're not talking about 15 million. In terms of the scope, the size of this, how rare is that? And do you think it's even feasible for a person to get this amount?
So when you look at companies like American Airlines or your big insurance companies or banks that might get sued, they can handle and stomach, you would think, potentially this type of litigation. Or if they can't, then there's bankruptcy, which I think Mr. Trump has said he's not going to have that as an option. That would stay things and that would pause things. Appeals are pay to play. The reason for that is 80% of judgments under the American Bar Association says about 80% of judgments go uncollected. There's a lot of reasons that would go behind that. There's a lot of folks who don't pay their credit card bills, and the credit card company brings a lawsuit saying you're a deadbeat, you hadn't paid us, and then they win, oftentimes a default judgment. But that's a reason why a lot of judgments don't get paid, or somebody sues a common dispute over a fence or something like that, where the guy building your fence takes the money and just disappears. You get a judgment of that guy against that guy, and he's got no intentions of paying it. There's a lot of deadbeats out there, and courts have basically said, we're not going to let you use our courts as a mechanism for avoiding paying your debts. You get your trial. If you lose your trial, you're not going to go spend a bunch of the other guys' time and money that they've already spent trying to run this money down. It's put up or shut up. And this just happens to be a really big number because the subject matter of it is so big. That's what makes this really difficult, and that's what makes it rarefied air. Another point to this is that Mr. Trump's a real estate guy, and I mean, I wish I had problems like this, but you got Elon Musk who, and Warren Buffett, those guys probably lose this kind of money in their sofa at home. The real estate mogul is leveraged to the hilt. That's what they do. They buy, they sell, they mortgage, they do all those things, which makes their money's tied up. It's not liquid. They can't write a check that big, or if they can, it's pretty rare. So you got a lot of these different things that are sort of converging almost to make a perfect storm. I mean, the guy is kind of behind the 8 ball tomorrow. We'll see what happens. I mean, I think if we learned anything, I think it's that we just don't know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, and some, like you mentioned, some of that money is just tied up in some of the assets he has, Trump Tower, different penthouses, Mar-a-Lago, like you just heard from Eric Trump as well. I want to ask you, because the lawyers for Trump kind of tried to get it down to like $100 million just for Monday, and then they continued to pay back. Was that a fair judgment, do you think, from what we learned during this case from the judge?
The appeals part's the kind of confusing part here, because if we let's break it down in half. Let's break it down into 2 parts. First thing is Trump obviously wants to appeal the whole shebang. He wants to appeal all of it because he thinks it's all bad, right? He thinks that the case against him was no good. He can't get there until he pays this bond. And now he's got an argument that and the second part is that this bond is too big. So his argument then for the immediate appeal is, look, I just can't even get my foot in the door until I can pay a lot more, until I can get some relief here. So he's trying to get the intermediate appellate court to say that bond is too high. It's not, let's make a deal. It's not bargaining or brokering. There are legal standards, and so far the appellate courts in New York haven't been inclined to really help the guy out.
Yeah, that's a really good description for someone that obviously doesn't work a ton in it like I do. I do have to ask you another question, because we also talked about it, Trump having this case, but also a variety of other cases, including the E. Jean Carroll case, where he was ordered to pay tens of millions of dollars as well. How do they line up? In what terms of precedence do they line up when you're looking at different cases, different amounts that he owes people? Is New York atop the list?
Money-wise, yes. All these other cases are criminal, and I mean, and it's a good tutorial, if you will. We learn Latin in law school. I don't know why, because we tend to go to court, we tend to speak English. But there's in Latin, in criminal law, there's corpus delicti. That's the body of the crime, or a habeas corpus. So in criminal law, it is your body going into the can and then locking the door. And that's one set of rules. And then this New York State case is obviously all financial. That's why he has to pay this bond to appeal. If it was a criminal case, you get criminal appeals at no cost, or much less cost. Obviously, you can have a public defender do that. That's because it's you're getting locked up. As an individual, you're getting locked up. So this is a money fight. He would be the best one to ask where does it hurt more, right? Does it hurt more the assets that are threatened, the pride factor? Because I think that a lot of folks who sitting through the trial, this is obviously intensely personal to the man, or I mean, as I think most people would be in a criminal setting, they'd be afraid of getting locked up. So I think that it's everybody sleeps differently at night, and only he knows what hurts more, is probably the best way to say it. Obviously, this one is pretty confounding to him, and clearly he's not found himself in this type of a predicament before. Is a sugar mama or daddy going to come tomorrow and get him out of this? Who knows? Who knows? But he's behind the 8 ball. There's just no question about that. And my guess is that if somebody would have bailed him out, that would have happened by now. He had that big public offering on his social media company, which sounds like it's going to be a good long-term investment, but it doesn't sound like it's going to turn into cash tomorrow.
Yeah, the short term is very short for them with just about 24 hours or so. And of course, you also mentioned just the pride factor that he has in the real estate. And we throw in the whole political landscape right now and the bid for the White House, and it just becomes a whole mess. I do have to ask you my last question, because you brought the word up a couple of times already, bankruptcy, and that could potentially talk about this. What does that mean? Could he file for it? It's very, very unlikely that the ego of Donald Trump files for bankruptcy, but if that does happen, is that a possibility, and what does that look like?
It's messy. Bankruptcy is federal, so in any time a litigant, somebody in a case files bankruptcy, everything gets paused, everything gets stopped, and then a whole different set of folks come in, and the state of New York would actually have to wait in line behind other people, other creditors who could potentially try to seize those assets. Mr. Trump has filed for bankruptcy before. Everything I've read said that's really not on his list of priorities here, or options, if you will. Probably a better way to put it. That would throw a big wrench into all of these things, and that would, when it stays the litigation, that's just the word that lawyers use for pausing it. So that would have the legal effect of pausing it, but it's kind of, it's also sort of hitting the nuclear button, right? I mean, at what cost do we want to pause this thing? I mean, do we want to let everybody kind of in on our assets and start picking away, or just New York State? Really a difficult choice for him, for sure.
Yeah, and it's very unlikely to happen, but I did want to get to some understanding if it does. All right, Jeremy Rosenthal, thank you so much for breaking it down. Tomorrow, of course, we're hurtling closer and closer to it. Nearly $500 million there on the line in this this civil lawsuit, excuse me. All right, thanks again for joining us.